They told you 1492 was the beginning. They told you the ocean was a wall. They told you Africa was waiting to be discovered, waiting to be civilized, waiting to be connected. But oceans are not walls. They are highways. And highways don't care about European timelines. Here's the question no textbook ever opens with. What if Africans crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus ever saw it? Not as captives, not in chains, but as navigators, explorers, traders, builders. Let's go somewhere uncomfortable. By the time Columbus sailed west, West Africa was not primitive. It was organized, wealthy, maritime capable. The Mali Empire controlled trans-Saharan trade routes that fed Europe gold for centuries. Timbuktu housed libraries. Scholars mapped stars. Shipbuilders constructed river fleets that dwarfed anything floating on Iberian waters at the time. So ask yourself something simple. If West Africans mastered rivers, currents, celestial navigation, and trade across thousands of miles of desert and coastline, why is it impossible that they pushed west into the Atlantic? Who decided that was impossible? Because here's the truth. The Atlantic current system doesn't move randomly. The Canary Current flows from West Africa directly toward the Caribbean. It's a natural conveyor belt. You don't need modern engines. You need wind knowledge and hull integrity. And West Africa had both. Now, before anyone panics, this isn't mythology. It's inquiry. It's evidence. It's pattern recognition. Let's talk about Abu Bakr II, early 14th century, ruler of Mali. According to Arab chroniclers like Al-Umari, Abu Bakr launched a massive fleet westward into the Atlantic around 1311. The first fleet never returned, so he launched another, larger, and went with it himself. He never came back. Now mainstream historians say, we have no physical proof they reached the Americas. Fair. But we do have ocean currents that would carry them there. We do have maritime knowledge capable of making the voyage, and we do have something else, oral memory. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he recorded something strange. Indigenous people told him dark-skinned visitors had arrived before him, visitors from the east. They traded metal-tipped spears. Columbus wrote this down, not because it supported Africa, because it surprised him. Metal in the Caribbean before Spanish arrival. That shouldn't have been there, and yet it was. Now let's zoom out. Archaeologists have found evidence of Old World crops in pre-Columbian soil layers, cotton varieties in the Americas that share genetic markers with African strains, botanical transfers that don't align cleanly with the official 1492 starting line. Does that prove a massive African civilization ruled ancient America? No, but it proves something moved. And plants don't build boats, people do. Let's go further. The Olmec heads of Mesoamerica, massive stone monuments carved around 1200 BCE, broad noses, full lips, distinct facial structures that have sparked debate for decades. Mainstream archaeology says they represent indigenous rulers, and they likely do. But why did early European observers describe them as Negroid in appearance? Why did the comparison arise repeatedly before modern racial politics even entered the discussion? Because something about the features disrupted expectations. Does that prove African colonization? No. But it does prove that history isn't as sealed as textbooks pretend. Now let's strip away exaggeration. This documentary is not about claiming Africa owned America. It's about dismantling the lie that Africa was isolated. It wasn't. Africa traded across the Sahara, across the Indian Ocean, across the Mediterranean. You're telling me the Atlantic was the only direction they never tried? That defies human curiosity. Here's what makes this topic dangerous. If Africans reached the Americas before Columbus, even in small numbers, it shatters the entire psychological architecture of discovery. Discovery implies emptiness. Discovery implies first contact. Discovery implies Europe initiated global movement. But what if global movement was already happening? What if 1492 wasn't a beginning, but an interruption? An interruption of existing exchange, an interruption that became violent and permanent. Because here's the quiet part. Pre-Columbian contact doesn't need to be massive to matter. It only needs to exist. One fleet, one trading mission, one group of navigators blown westward by current and storm. Human history is full of accidents that changed continents. The Vikings reached North America centuries before Columbus. That was considered myth until L'Anse aux Meadows was excavated in Newfoundland. For hundreds of years, that story was dismissed. Then, archaeology caught up. So the question isn't, why isn't there a giant African city ruin in Mexico? The question is simpler. Is it historically possible Africans crossed the Atlantic before Columbus? Oceanographically, yes. Technologically, yes. Historically recorded attempts? Yes. Archaeologically debated traces? Yes. Then why is the idea treated as fantasy? Because narratives protect hierarchy, and hierarchy collapses when Africa stops being the last to arrive. So this isn't about fantasy kingdoms. It's about probability. It's about movement. It's about refusing to accept that Africa's story begins in chains. Because long before Columbus sailed west, Africa was already looking outward. The real question is, if contact happened even quietly, what traces would it leave behind? And where should we actually be looking? Let's leave the Atlantic for a moment, because the ocean isn't the only evidence. The land itself keeps secrets, and soil does not care about politics. If Africans reached the Americas before Columbus, even in small numbers, they wouldn't leave behind massive empires stamped with property of Mali. They would leave fragments, metals, linguistic echoes, burial anomalies, technological fingerprints, and that's where this gets uncomfortable. In multiple regions of Central and South America, archaeologists have uncovered metal alloys that don't line up cleanly with the local metallurgical timeline. Not giant swords, not African flags, but composition patterns, copper-gold blends resembling West African smelting techniques. Now here's the thing about metallurgy. It's not guesswork. You don't accidentally reproduce alloy formulas from another continent without shared knowledge or parallel development. And parallel development is always the default explanation. It's safe. It keeps the story clean. But when you start mapping where certain metallurgical styles appear, especially in pre-Columbian contexts, you begin noticing geographic clustering along coastal zones. Coastal zones matter because that's where ships land. Now let's talk about navigation. West African sailors weren't reckless drifters. They understood celestial positioning. They tracked stars. They observed currents. They built river fleets capable of long-distance trade. And here's what most people don't realize. You don't need to discover America intentionally to reach it. The Atlantic gyre system naturally loops. If you leave from Senegambia or the Gulf of Guinea during the right season, the current carries you west. If you survive landfall, you can follow northern currents back east. Nature built the highway. Now let's pivot to something even stranger. Early Spanish chroniclers documented indigenous accounts of pre-Columbian visitors with different skin tones arriving from the east. Not white Europeans, not bearded Norsemen, different. Descriptions vary. Some mention dark-skinned traders, some mention metal exchange, some mention unfamiliar speech patterns. Historians usually wave this off as misinterpretation after contact, but Columbus wrote some of it down before full-scale colonization reshaped the narrative. And first impressions matter. Now, let's talk genetics. Modern genetic studies of indigenous American populations overwhelmingly show Asian migration via the Bering Strait thousands of years ago. That's established. But small-scale contact events do not always leave large genetic signatures. If a few dozen or even a few hundred sailors intermarried with coastal communities centuries before Columbus, their DNA could diffuse and become nearly invisible over generations, especially after European colonization devastated populations and reshuffled demographics entirely. Absence of overwhelming genetic dominance does not equal absence of contact. History is not always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper that survived a hurricane. Now let's step deeper. Linguistics. Across parts of the Caribbean and northern South America, researchers have identified words with phonetic similarities to Mandinka and Wolof roots. Are they proof? No. But linguistics rarely offers proof. It offers patterns, and patterns become interesting when they repeat. Now combine that with maritime capability, ocean currents, chronicler accounts, metallurgical anomalies, and botanical transfers. Individually, each piece can be dismissed. Together, they form friction, and friction is where investigation begins. Now let's move to architecture. Across the Americas, we see advanced stonework, astronomical alignment, and pyramid structures long before European contact. No, pyramids are not uniquely African. Civilizations around the world built monumental architecture independently. But here's the uncomfortable question. Why do we assume cultural exchange only moved east to west after 1492? Why is pre-1492 transatlantic exchange treated as fantasy when trans-Pacific exchange theories are increasingly explored seriously? Because Africa sits at the bottom of the global hierarchy in the modern imagination. So African exploration feels less plausible to some minds. That's not science. That's bias. Now here's where the conversation sharpens. The dominant global narrative says Africa was acted upon, Europe acted, Asia influenced, the Americas received. But that model collapses under scrutiny. Human beings move. Curiosity predates empires. Storms redirect ships. Trade expands. Ideas travel. And the Atlantic was not some supernatural barrier. Now imagine this scenario. A fleet leaves West Africa. Some ships vanish. One or two survive landfall in the Caribbean. They trade. They exchange knowledge. They intermarry. They leave behind metal techniques, maybe seeds, maybe stories. Then they disappear back into the current or into the land. Centuries later, Columbus arrives. He believes he discovered something untouched, but he's walking onto a shoreline that may have already seen other sails. Now understand something clearly. This documentary is not claiming a massive African civilization dominated pre-Columbian America. It's asking whether contact occurred. Contact changes everything because contact rewrites the timeline. And once the timeline shifts, so does power. If Africans reached the Americas before Columbus, even quietly, then Africa was not waiting to enter world history. It was already participating in it. And that idea makes certain narratives uncomfortable because the myth of discovery props up centuries of hierarchy. But myths crack under pressure, and pressure builds when evidence accumulates. So the real question isn't, did Africa colonize America? It's this: how many small contacts, storms, exchanges, and forgotten voyages happened before Europe decided to name the map? And more importantly, why are we so resistant to the possibility? Because the resistance says more than the evidence. Let's talk about something nobody likes to examine: what was destroyed? Because absence is not proof of impossibility. Sometimes it's proof of erasure. When the Spanish arrived in the Americas, they didn't just conquer land. They burned libraries. They destroyed codices. They dismantled temples. They rewrote memory. In Mesoamerica alone, thousands of indigenous manuscripts were incinerated under the justification of purifying pagan knowledge. Think about that. Entire knowledge systems gone. So when modern historians say there's no written record of African contact, what exactly are they referencing? The records that survived colonial fire or the ones that didn't? Now, here's where it gets real. If any pre-Columbian contact occurred between Africans and coastal American societies, those stories would have been preserved orally, not carved in European Latin. Oral traditions do not survive conquest easily, especially when conquerors labeled them superstition. But fragments survived anyway. Among certain Caribbean and Central American indigenous traditions, there are accounts of Eastern visitors arriving before Europeans. Different complexion, different trade goods, different language. Historians debate interpretation, fair, but debate doesn't erase the record. It means the record exists. Now, zoom out. Imagine being a Spanish chronicler landing in the Caribbean, hearing indigenous people speak of prior visitors. Would you amplify that, or would you minimize it? Because if other Old World peoples reach these shores first, the Spanish claim of divine discovery weakens. And colonial legitimacy was everything. Discovery justified conquest. Conquest justified extraction. Extraction justified empire. If discovery collapses, the moral scaffolding collapses. So what happens to inconvenient stories? They get footnoted, or reframed, or ignored. Now let's shift angles entirely. Maritime drift. Modern experiments have shown that traditional West African vessels, even basic reed boats, can survive Atlantic crossings under the right seasonal conditions. Thor Heyerdahl's expeditions in the 20th century proved something important. Ancient technology was capable of transoceanic travel long before Europeans industrialized shipbuilding. If Polynesians could traverse the Pacific thousands of years ago, if Vikings could reach Newfoundland, why does the Atlantic become sacred territory when Africa enters the conversation? Why does possibility suddenly shrink? Now here's the part people overlook. The Atlantic was not empty before Columbus. It was active. Fishermen from Iberia traveled along West African coasts. Trade between North Africa and Europe was centuries old. The idea that Africans were unfamiliar with open water is historically false. They weren't confined to shorelines. They were traders, navigators, shipbuilders. And here's another uncomfortable layer: gold. When Europeans reached West Africa, they didn't introduce gold. They came for it. West Africa had long been feeding European markets with gold via trans-Saharan trade. If West African navigators pushed west and encountered lands rich in resources, would they ignore it or trade? Trade is older than conquest, and trade leaves subtle marks, not monuments, not flags, but goods that don't match geography. Now let's flip this entire conversation upside down. Instead of asking whether Africans reached America, ask why the burden of proof is so asymmetrical. When Europeans claim exploration, it's assumed bold and visionary. When Africans are placed in that same narrative, it becomes extraordinary, suspicious, fringe. Why? Because modern racial hierarchies still influence what we consider plausible. We underestimate African maritime capacity because colonial propaganda spent centuries portraying Africa as static. But that portrayal was strategic. Static people are easier to dominate. Now let's get sharper. Pre-Columbian America was not isolated. Trade networks stretched across continents within the Americas themselves, from the Mississippi Valley to Mesoamerica. Goods moved, ideas moved. So if a small group of African sailors made landfall in the Caribbean, their presence wouldn't stay local forever. Trade networks would disperse materials inland. Stories would travel. And centuries later, archaeologists would find anomalies. An alloy here, a crop there, a facial description in early colonial notes. Nothing overwhelming, but enough to raise eyebrows. And history often changes on raised eyebrows. Now here's the real tension. If pre-Columbian African contact happened, even at a small scale, it doesn't erase indigenous achievement. It doesn't rewrite American civilizations as African. It simply adds dimension, and dimension makes narratives harder to weaponize. Because once Africa enters the story as explorer instead of captive, the psychological balance shifts. Africa stops being introduced to the Americas in chains. It arrives in sails, and that reframing hits deep because identity is shaped by origin stories. Now here's the question that lingers in the silence. If evidence exists in fragments, if oral traditions whisper, if maritime capability was real, if colonial destruction erased unknown volumes of pre-contact memory, then what would it take to change the consensus? One excavation? One preserved document? One shipwreck off a Caribbean coast with unmistakable West African construction methods? History has flipped before on smaller discoveries. So maybe the real story isn't whether Africa reached America before Columbus. Maybe it's that we've been asking the wrong questions. Not, did it happen? But why are we afraid it might have? Because fear reveals where power sits, and power does not like its origin stories challenged. No burning libraries, no ocean currents, no metallurgy callbacks, no repeating drift theory. We escalate the psychology. Ancient Black America, before Columbus Chunk 4, 800 words. Let's confront the real battlefield, not the ocean, not the soil, the mind, because this entire debate lives inside imagination before it lives inside evidence. Close your eyes and picture ancient America. What do you see? Pyramids in Mexico, mounds in the Mississippi Valley, stone cities in Peru. Now picture ancient Africa. Deserts, tribes, mud huts. That reaction wasn't accidental. That image was constructed. For centuries, European scholarship deliberately minimized African complexity to justify colonial expansion. Africa was framed as land without advanced navigation, without large-scale architecture, without scientific literacy. That wasn't ignorance. It was strategy. If Africa is painted as static, then Africa cannot logically be cast as explorer. And if Africa cannot be explorer, then Africa cannot predate Europe in reaching the Americas. See how that works? It's not about boats, it's about belief ceilings. Now let's dismantle one. Ancient Africa built monumental architecture long before Columbus. The Great Zimbabwe Complex in southern Africa demonstrated advanced stone construction without mortar. Nubian pyramids in Sudan outnumber Egyptian ones. The Kingdom of Axum minted coins, traded with Rome, and operated Red Sea fleets. Navigation requires three things: materials, knowledge of stars, and incentive. Africa had all three. The stars over Timbuktu were the same stars over Lisbon. Celestial navigation is universal. Now here's what nobody likes to say. We have archaeological evidence that transoceanic contact happened in multiple directions in the ancient world. Polynesians likely reached South America before Europeans. Evidence suggests sweet potatoes traveled across the Pacific long before Columbus. So if Pacific contact is plausible, why is Atlantic contact treated like fantasy? Because the Atlantic narrative underpins modern Western identity. If Africa crossed it first, even briefly, the symbolism shifts. Symbolism matters. Now let's get surgical. The Americas were not empty before Columbus, but they were also not sealed in glass. Coastal cultures traded constantly. They fished. They sailed short distances. They understood tides. If foreign ships arrived and didn't immediately invade, interaction would look like trade. Trade does not always leave monumental ruins. Sometimes it leaves integration. Now imagine a scenario where African sailors, arriving accidentally or intentionally, were absorbed into a coastal community. Over generations, they become part of that society. Their story becomes local legend. Their phenotype blends. Their knowledge integrates. Then centuries later, European colonization detonates the demographic balance entirely. Populations collapse from disease. Communities scatter. Oral memory fractures. And when modern historians arrive, they examine a post-catastrophe landscape and declare it untouched before 1492. But untouched compared to what? Compared to a pre-disease population that no longer exists. We forget how violently colonization disrupted continuity. Now here's another layer: color perception. Indigenous Americans varied in skin tone widely across regions. European chroniclers often exaggerated difference or flattened nuance in their descriptions. So when they wrote about encountering dark or very dark individuals among indigenous populations, we often default to assuming they meant local variation. But what if some variation came from prior contact? Not domination, contact. Now here's where the tension tightens. There are skeletal remains in parts of the Americas that early anthropologists labeled as having African features. Modern scholarship often revises those claims as flawed racial typology. Fair. 19th century race science was deeply biased, but the fact that those assessments existed at all tells you something. The possibility was visible enough to be debated. Debate doesn't happen in a vacuum. Now step back and look at how narratives form. Columbus arrives. Spain builds empire. The story becomes Europe initiates global connection. That story spreads through textbooks, paintings, museums, national holidays. Centuries pass. The myth hardens. And once hardened, any evidence that predates 1492 feels destabilizing. But destabilizing doesn't mean false. It means disruptive. And disruption is healthy in scholarship. Now let's sharpen it further. If Africans reached the Americas before Columbus, even in limited capacity, it means Africa participated in the age of exploration before Europe formalized it. That changes psychological hierarchy. It moves Africa from reactive to proactive, and that's why resistance is so strong, because historical status is power. Now here's the uncomfortable mirror. We accept Viking contact because it fits the European exploration arc. We entertain Polynesian contact because it fits a Pacific maritime genius narrative. But African Atlantic contact? That threatens two hierarchies at once: European discovery mythology and colonial depictions of African incapacity. So it gets labeled fringe faster, not because it's disproven, but because it's inconvenient. Now here's the real challenge. If one confirmed artifact surfaced tomorrow, undeniably West African in construction, carbon dated pre-1492, recovered from Caribbean coastal sediment, would the narrative shift overnight, or would resistance double down? History is not just about facts, it's about willingness, and willingness depends on identity. So the deeper question isn't whether Africans could reach the Americas before Columbus, it's whether the modern world is ready to reimagine the map. Because once the map shifts, the power hierarchy shifts, and power never shifts quietly. Let's leave the coast. Let's go inland. Because everyone keeps staring at shorelines like history only happens where waves touch sand. But civilizations don't begin at beaches. They expand from them. And if any pre-Columbian African contact occurred, even briefly, the real story wouldn't stay at the water's edge. It would move up rivers, through trade corridors, across cultural exchange networks, and the Americas were covered in them. Long before Europeans arrived, massive inland systems connected distant societies. The Mississippi River functioned like an arterial highway. Goods moved from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. Copper from the north traveled south. Shells from the ocean moved inland. Obsidian crossed mountains. Nothing stayed local. So let's ask something different. If even a small African group arrived, what would spread? Language? Maybe not quickly. Genetics? Possibly. Technology? More likely. Ideas? Almost certainly, because ideas move faster than bloodlines. Now think about agricultural knowledge. West African societies mastered tropical crop management. They understood rice cultivation, soil rotation, irrigation techniques suited for humid climates. Meanwhile, parts of the Americas had sophisticated farming systems already. Raised fields, terrace agriculture, chinampas in Mesoamerica. Now here's the interesting tension. Agricultural innovation doesn't require conquest. It requires observation. If two societies meet peacefully, the first thing exchanged isn't usually religion. It's survival knowledge, seeds, tools, techniques. And survival knowledge rarely gets labeled as foreign centuries later. It becomes traditional. Now let's pivot sharply. Music, rhythm, percussive culture. Before colonization, many indigenous American societies had complex rhythmic traditions. Drums, flutes, ceremonial chants structured around cyclical timing patterns. West African musical systems were also deeply rhythmic, mathematically layered, polyrhythmic. Parallel development is possible, of course, but when two regions separated by an ocean share structural rhythm similarities, historians debate coincidence. That debate matters, because cultural resonance sometimes hints at forgotten intersections. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. We've been trained to think African cultural influence in the Americas begins in the 1500s, but what if that's just when it became documented? Documentation is not origin, it's recognition. Now consider this. When Europeans first encountered certain indigenous groups, they described individuals with tightly curled hair and broader facial features than surrounding populations. Historians attribute it to natural diversity. Fair. Human populations are complex, But here's the deeper issue. Once colonization rewrote the racial hierarchy, any pre-existing African presence would have been absorbed into the new racial caste system, reclassified, reinterpreted, and eventually forgotten. Because colonial society simplified identity brutally. You were European, or indigenous, or African. Categories hardened. Anything in between vanished under law. Now imagine a coastal American community centuries before Columbus, where a handful of African sailors integrated peacefully. No conquest, no colony, just coexistence. Generations pass. Their descendants identify as local. Then European conquest arrives. Census takers demand racial categories. Skin tone becomes political. Suddenly, complex ancestry becomes inconvenient, and complexity gets erased. History doesn't just forget, it edits. Now zoom further inland. The mound-building cultures of North America constructed massive earthworks aligned with celestial bodies. Some spanned hundreds of acres. Precision planning, astronomical knowledge. These weren't isolated tribes wandering forests. They were organized societies, complex, networked. Now here's the tension point. When Europeans encountered these earthworks centuries later, many refused to believe indigenous people built them. They invented lost white civilizations to explain them. They invented myths about vanished races. Anything but give credit where it belonged. So if European scholars were willing to fabricate entire lost civilizations to avoid acknowledging indigenous brilliance, how resistant would they be to acknowledging potential African contact? Bias shapes interpretation. It always has. Now let's tighten the lens. Artifacts don't shout their origin. They whisper. A bead out of place. A carving with unusual stylistic overlap. A linguistic anomaly. None of these prove sweeping narratives alone, but clusters of anomalies invite investigation. And investigation threatens established timelines, so it gets resisted. Now here's the real point. Ancient Black America, if it existed in any capacity before Columbus, would not look like colonization. It wouldn't look like flags planted in soil. It would look subtle, integrated, absorbed. Because small-scale contact leaves cultural fingerprints, not monuments. And fingerprints fade when entire societies are shattered by disease and conquest. So maybe the question isn't, where are the massive African cities in pre-Columbian America? Maybe the question is, what quiet threads have we mistaken for coincidence? What integrated influences have we mislabeled as isolated development? What stories were simplified because complexity disrupts power structures? Because here's the thing, history loves heroes. It loves firsts. It loves singular discovery moments. But real history is layered, messy, interconnected. And ancient oceans were not walls. They were bridges, sometimes crossed intentionally, sometimes accidentally. And when bridges exist, someone eventually walks across. The only question is, who remembers? Let's talk about maps, because maps don't just show geography, they show power. Every empire draws the world in a way that centers itself. Every dominant civilization redraws the globe to make its story look inevitable. So here's a question. No one asked loudly. Who controlled the early maps of the Atlantic? Before Columbus sailed west, European cartographers already depicted mysterious islands beyond Africa, phantom lands, speculative coastlines, shapes that look suspiciously like memory without confession. Medieval Islamic geographers also recorded stories of voyages into the Western Ocean. They described currents, winds, unknown lands, not fairy tales, navigational notes. Now think carefully. If West African sailors ventured westward, intentionally or not, would their knowledge automatically become written in European Latin, or would it circulate through North African and Mediterranean trade networks first? Because Africa was not isolated from Europe before Columbus. North Africa was deeply connected to Iberia. Moorish Spain existed for centuries. Knowledge flowed across the Strait of Gibraltar constantly. Astronomy, mathematics, cartography. And here's the twist. Columbus himself studied in environments saturated with Islamic geographic scholarship. He wasn't navigating blind superstition. He inherited centuries of trans-Mediterranean knowledge exchange. So when Europe finally looked west, it wasn't pure innovation. It was accumulated intelligence. Now here's where it gets interesting. Some early European maps show coastlines that appear more accurate than they should have been for that period. Scholars debate whether this was coincidence, advanced estimation, or access to older unknown sources. But that debate reveals something bigger. History is rarely created from scratch. It's layered, and when new powers rise, they inherit older knowledge systems quietly. So here's the uncomfortable possibility. If African sailors reached Western lands before Columbus, their knowledge wouldn't need to appear in grand chronicles. It could enter the system indirectly, through trade stories, through navigational hints, through secondhand reports that later European explorers repackage as their own discovery. That's how intellectual inheritance often works. Now let's pivot hard. Europe didn't suddenly become maritime geniuses in the 1400s. They learned from the Mediterranean world, from North Africa, from the Islamic Golden Age, from centuries of shipbuilding evolution in regions Europeans later labeled other. Caravels, the ships that made Atlantic travel viable, were influenced by lateen sail designs common in Arab and North African vessels. That's not conspiracy. That's documented maritime development. So if African navigation influenced Mediterranean sailing technology, and Mediterranean sailing technology enabled Atlantic crossing, then Africa indirectly shaped the so-called Age of Discovery, and that reframes the story. Now imagine something even sharper. What if fragments of earlier westward voyages existed in Mediterranean rumor networks long before Columbus? Rumors of lands beyond the horizon. Rumors dismissed as legend until someone with political backing pursued them. Columbus didn't convince Spain that the ocean was empty. He convinced them something was there. Where did that certainty come from? Maps, stories, possibility embedded in prior knowledge. Now step into the psychology again. Europe wanted a westward route to Asia to bypass Islamic-controlled trade routes. The Ottoman Empire controlled critical land corridors, so Europe looked for alternatives, but they didn't invent the ocean. They exploited it. Now imagine West African sailors centuries earlier experimenting with that same ocean, not to conquer, but to explore or trade. They would not have written letters to European monarchs. They would not have claimed territory in the name of crowns. They would have moved quietly, and quiet movement rarely becomes official narrative. Now here's another angle rarely discussed. Climate cycles. The Atlantic world experienced periods of favorable wind patterns during certain centuries. Navigation windows open and close over time. So even if early contact occurred in a limited period, later attempts might have failed, reinforcing skepticism. History often remembers the last attempt, not the first, and success isn't always permanent. Now here's the deeper tension. When Columbus returned from his first voyage, he didn't find Asia. He found land unknown to Europe, But unknown to Europe does not equal unknown to humanity. That distinction matters. Europe didn't discover the Americas, it discovered them for itself. So when we talk about ancient Black America before Columbus, we're not trying to crown a different conqueror. We're challenging the idea that Europe was first in motion, because motion existed globally long before European expansion. Now let's zoom out even further. The Atlantic slave trade reshaped global demographics so violently that it blurred the memory of any earlier African presence in the Americas. Once millions of Africans were forcibly transported, any earlier voluntary or accidental contact would be statistically invisible, overwritten by magnitude. So even if African footprints existed centuries before 1492, they would be swallowed by the later catastrophe. History would compress it all into one chapter. Africa arrives after Columbus. Neat. Simple. False in its simplicity. Now here's the real friction. If Africa had agency in Atlantic exploration before Europe industrialized it, then the moral narrative of the modern world shifts. Africa becomes participant, not merely victim. And participation complicates power hierarchies built on victimhood narratives. Not because victimhood isn't real, it absolutely is, but because African history is broader than suffering alone, and that breadth unsettles simplistic storytelling. So here's the question that cuts deep. Did Europe lead the Atlantic story, or did it formalize a route others had already tested? Because formalization gets monuments, testing gets erased, and erasure is often mistaken for absence. No maps, no Mediterranean, no sails, no climate cycles. We pivot again, somewhere nobody expects. Ancient Black America. Before Columbus Chunk 7, 800 words. Let's talk about faces, because history isn't only written in stone or ink, it's written in bone. For over a century, physical anthropologists obsessed over skull measurements. They classified, categorized, ranked, theorized. Most of it was flawed. Some of it was outright racist pseudoscience. But buried inside that messy discipline were anomalies. Early excavations in parts of the Americas uncovered skeletal remains that did not neatly fit European racial models. Some researchers described cranial features they labeled as African-like. Others pushed back, arguing variation within native populations explained everything. The debate still simmers quietly. Now let's be precise. Modern anthropology rejects simplistic racial typology. Human variation is fluid. Features overlap across continents. Correct. But here's what's fascinating. The very existence of that early debate proves something. The morphology was distinct enough to raise eyebrows, not enough to rewrite consensus, but enough to disturb certainty. And disturbances matter, because history doesn't move on overwhelming proof alone. It moves when enough anomalies accumulate to demand reevaluation. Now zoom out. Human migration did not follow straight lines. Ancient populations moved in waves, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by accident, sometimes by catastrophe. Storms redirect ships. Currents displace vessels. Survivors adapt where they land. The Americas were peopled originally by migrations across Beringia thousands of years ago. That migration reshaped continents, so movement is not foreign to human history. Isolation is the anomaly. Now here's something rarely discussed in mainstream classrooms. Genetic studies in certain remote American populations have occasionally revealed unexpected markers, signals that spark curiosity before being attributed to later admixture. Often, those signals get categorized as post-Columbian mixing. Fair. The transatlantic upheaval was massive, but here's the blind spot. When millions of Africans arrived after 1500, they didn't land evenly across the continent. Distribution varied. So when genetic signals appear in regions with limited documented importation during early colonial periods, scholars dig deeper. Sometimes the answer is straightforward, sometimes it isn't. And when it isn't, it becomes academic footnote territory. Now let's step into cultural memory again. Not the coastal myths we've already explored, but inland folklore. Some southeastern Native American oral histories reference ancestors who arrived from across the Great Water long before Europeans. These aren't colonial-era reinterpretations. They are embedded origin strands within the stories themselves. Are they metaphorical? Possibly. Are they proof? No. But they are part of the historical ecosystem, and ecosystems don't exist without roots. Now here's the uncomfortable reality. Colonial America had incentive to simplify identity immediately. The moment race became legal code, nuance vanished. If someone looked African, they were classified accordingly. If someone didn't, they weren't. Mixed heritage, ancient integration, layered ancestry, none of it mattered under plantation law. So even if pre-1492 African-descended individuals existed within certain native communities, colonial bureaucracy would not preserve that complexity. It would flatten it. And flattened identities are easier to archive. Now let's talk about something else entirely. Body art, scarification. Certain indigenous American groups practice forms of skin marking and ceremonial patterning. Some West African societies practice similar visible body modifications. Parallel evolution? Yes. Human cultures independently develop similar rituals frequently. But here's the tension. When Europeans documented body markings in both regions, they often interpreted African practices as primitive and American practices as exotic, rarely considering potential historical cross-pollination, because that would imply movement, and movement challenges hierarchy. Now take this further. Certain American agricultural rituals and spiritual cosmologies emphasize water crossings, eastern horizons, ancestral arrival from beyond the sea. Symbolism again? Perhaps. But symbolism often preserves memory in coded form, and when conquerors suppress overt historical memory, cultures encode it in myth, not to deceive, to survive. Now let's be disciplined. None of this is definitive proof. That's not the point. The point is pattern density. When Skeletal debates, genetic whispers, inland folklore, ritual parallels, and colonial flattening all intersect in the same historical corridor, dismissal becomes intellectually lazy. Serious scholarship doesn't scoff, it investigates. Now here's the deeper layer. Why does even the suggestion of ancient Black America before Columbus provoke emotional reaction? Because it destabilizes a deeply internalized timeline. The modern world is psychologically anchored to 1492 as beginning of connection, beginning of global exchange, beginning of African presence in the Americas. If African presence predates that anchor, the timeline shifts backward, and when timelines shift, origin stories unravel, and origin stories are sacred to power structures. Now imagine the intellectual earthquake. If tomorrow, archaeologists uncovered a pre-1492 burial site in the Caribbean with clear West African isotopic signatures, confirmed by multiple labs, immune to dismissal, what would change first? Textbooks or resistance? Because history doesn't resist facts. People resist implications. And the implication here is enormous. Africa was not waiting to be moved. Africa was moving long before it was forced. And that possibility alone reframes centuries of narrative. No skeletal debates, no genetics, no body markings, no inland folklore callbacks. We escalate into something sharper, something strategic. Ancient Black America, before Columbus chunk 800 words. Let's talk about silence, not absence of evidence. Silence in academia. There's a difference, because in the world of scholarship, what gets funding shapes what gets discovered, and what gets discovered shapes what gets believed. Now think about this carefully. How many major research grants have been issued specifically to investigate potential African transatlantic contact before 1492? Not to debunk it, not to dismiss it, to genuinely explore it. Very few, because funding follows consensus, and consensus follows tradition, and tradition protects dominant frameworks. Now imagine you're a young archaeologist. You're applying for tenure. You have two research proposals. Proposal A, expand on well-established colonial trade networks. Proposal B, investigate possible pre-Columbian African contact with the Americas. Which one feels safer? Which one guarantees peer approval? Academia rewards caution, not disruption. So certain questions remain understudied not because they are disproven, but because they are professionally risky. Now let's move into historiography, how history is written. For centuries, Western scholarship centered Europe as the engine of global movement. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Age of Discovery. Everything radiates outward from Europe in that narrative. Africa appears mostly as resource pool or victim. So when evidence or theories surface that place Africa in a proactive maritime role, it conflicts with the inherited structure, and structures resist fracture. Now here's something critical. This isn't about conspiracy, it's about inertia. Institutions are slow to change. Scholars build careers on established frameworks. Textbooks replicate those frameworks. Teachers teach them. Students internalize them. Generations pass, and suddenly the framework feels like truth, not because it's flawless, but because it's familiar. Now here's a sharp edge. Even when new evidence surfaces, artifacts, isotopic testing, radiocarbon anomalies, interpretation depends on who analyzes them. Evidence doesn't interpret itself. Humans do, and humans bring bias, sometimes unconscious, sometimes defensive. Now let's talk about terminology. When African presence is suggested in ancient contexts outside the continent, the language used often shifts. Instead of explorers, you'll hear drifters. Instead of navigators, you'll hear accidental arrivals. Instead of maritime exchange, you'll hear speculative anomaly. Words matter. They frame legitimacy. European movement is intentional. African movement becomes accidental. That framing alone reveals inherited hierarchy. Now, zoom out further. The Atlantic slave trade permanently altered how the world views African mobility. After 1500, African transatlantic movement becomes synonymous with forced displacement, chains, captivity, commerce in human bodies. That trauma overwrites any earlier narrative of voluntary African movement westward. So psychologically, it feels wrong to imagine Africa crossing the Atlantic before Columbus without coercion. But history is not obligated to match modern trauma narratives. Africa's story did not begin with enslavement, and its maritime capacity did not suddenly activate only when Europeans demanded labor. Now let's introduce another tension. Modern DNA databases are expanding rapidly. As more indigenous American communities conduct genetic testing, unexpected ancestral signals occasionally surface. Not enough to rewrite history, but enough to complicate it. Complication is the enemy of myth, and myths defend themselves aggressively. Now here's the real friction. If ancient Black America existed even in small pockets before Columbus, it would not align neatly with national narratives in either the United States or Latin America. National histories prefer clarity, founding dates, clear arrivals, clear identities. Pre-1492, African presence muddies that clarity. It introduces gray, and gray resists patriotic storytelling. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. Why is the idea treated as fringe before being fully investigated? Why is skepticism so immediate? Healthy skepticism is necessary, but reflexive dismissal, that's emotional, and emotional responses signal ideological investment. Now let's turn the mirror inward. The debate itself reveals something profound. People care deeply about who arrived first, because first implies ownership of narrative. But history is rarely about first. It's about connection. Multiple groups can reach a land without erasing each other. Contact doesn't equal conquest. But modern minds, shaped by colonial history, struggle to imagine contact without domination. So when African pre-Columbian presence is suggested, people assume it implies conquest narrative replacement. It doesn't. It implies intersection. And intersection destabilizes linear storytelling. Now here's a final tension for this chapter. If tomorrow, overwhelming evidence confirmed ancient Black America before Columbus, it would not erase indigenous brilliance. It would not crown Africa as conqueror. It would simply expand the story, but expansion requires intellectual humility. And humility is difficult for civilizations built on triumph narratives, so the silence continues. Not because the question lacks merit, but because answering it honestly requires redrawing the mental map. And redrawing maps is never comfortable for those who benefit from the old one. Let's strip this down to something raw. Artifacts don't lie, they just get ignored. Across the Americas, museums hold objects that don't fit cleanly into the dominant narrative. Not dramatic, not headline worthy, just strange enough to sit in quiet drawers with cautious labels. Carvings with facial features that don't match surrounding artistic norms. Metalwork techniques appearing earlier than expected. Botanical traces that don't align neatly with assumed trade routes. None of these are definitive, but none of them are nothing. Now here's the problem. History doesn't change on isolated finds. It changes on accumulation, and accumulation requires attention, but attention requires willingness, and willingness depends on narrative flexibility. Now imagine this. An excavation team uncovers a burial site dated securely to the 13th century in the Caribbean. Among the remains, they find personal adornments constructed with methods consistent with West African craftsmanship, not European, not indigenous American, specific. What happens next? The object goes through authentication, testing, peer review, debate. Then something subtle occurs. Interpretation battles begin. Is it contamination? Later intrusion? Misidentification? Every alternative explanation is exhausted before the most disruptive one is accepted. That's normal science, but it also reveals resistance thresholds. Now think about how many minor anomalies never receive that level of scrutiny because they don't fit grant priorities or headline cycles. Small finds fade quietly, and quiet fading builds silence. Now let's move to a different layer entirely. Ocean debris. Every year, storms dredge up objects long buried under coastal sediment: ship fragments, timber remnants, metal shards. Most are dismissed as colonial-era wreckage, but carbon dating doesn't lie easily. If pre-1492 ship remains with construction techniques distinct from European design were found, it would force reevaluation, and reevaluation disrupts institutional confidence. Now here's the deeper issue. Historians are trained to avoid grand conclusions without overwhelming proof. That caution is healthy, but it can also calcify into overcorrection. If a theory has been associated with fringe voices in the past, serious scholars hesitate to touch it, even when evidence deserves examination. Reputation risk is real, and reputation shapes discourse. Now let's pivot into something even sharper. Think about how quickly the world accepted Viking presence in North America once L'Anse aux Meadows was excavated. One confirmed site, radiocarbon dated, European artifacts, narrative adjusted, textbooks updated, no emotional resistance. Why? Because it fit within the broader European exploration arc. It extended an existing story. It didn't challenge the foundation. Now imagine the equivalent site confirming West African presence pre-1492. Would the emotional reaction be as smooth, or would debate stretch decades? Not because evidence is weaker, but because implications are heavier. Now here's the crucial shift. The argument isn't that Africa colonized the Americas. It's that movement may have occurred in ways erased by later catastrophe. That's not fantasy. That's historical possibility. And possibility deserves investigation, not mockery. Now let's dig into something rarely discussed publicly. Underwater archaeology in the Atlantic Basin remains drastically underfunded compared to Mediterranean or European coastal research. Shipwrecks older than 1492 in Caribbean waters are difficult to locate and expensive to study. Technology is improving. Remote sensing, deep water scanning. But we are only scratching the surface, literally. So declaring definitive absence feels premature. Now imagine 50 years from now. Advanced submersible mapping technology scans the Atlantic floor in unprecedented detail. Hidden wrecks surface. New chronologies emerge, history shifts, and future generations look back at our certainty and call it naive. It wouldn't be the first time. History is filled with confident declarations later overturned by excavation. Now here's the emotional core. Why does this matter? Because representation in origin stories shapes identity. If Africa appears only in the Americas after 1492 and only through forced displacement, it compresses an entire continent's narrative into tragedy. But if Africa appears earlier, even subtly, as explorer, trader, navigator, it restores dimension, not superiority, dimension, and dimension humanizes. Now here's the final tension for this chapter. The Atlantic is vast, history is incomplete, and certainty is often louder than evidence. So when someone says, there is no proof Africans reached the Americas before Columbus, what they usually mean is, there is no consensus. Consensus is not the same as impossibility. Consensus is agreement, and agreement shifts with discovery. So maybe the real story isn't ancient Black America confirmed. Maybe it's ancient Black America investigated honestly, without ridicule, without ideological reflex, without fear of narrative adjustment, because history isn't fragile. It can handle expansion. The only question is whether we can. No artifacts drawer talk, no underwater archaeology, no Vikings comparison, no representation framing. We go somewhere deeper, bigger, final level tension, ancient Black America, before Columbus chunked in, 800 words. Let's zoom all the way out. Forget objects, forget bones, forget ships. Look at time. Human beings have been crossing water for tens of thousands of years, not hundreds, not since Columbus, tens of thousands. Australia was reached by sea over 60,000 years ago. The Mediterranean was a highway before Rome existed. Polynesians navigated the Pacific with no metal instruments, memorizing star paths across thousands of miles of open water. So the real question isn't whether ancient people could cross oceans. They could. The real question is, why do we mentally limit certain civilizations and not others? Because when we say ancient Black America before Columbus is unlikely, what we're really revealing is a comfort zone. We are comfortable imagining certain people as explorers and uncomfortable imagining others in that role. That discomfort didn't grow naturally. It was cultivated. Centuries of colonial ideology conditioned the world to associate innovation and expansion with Europe and stasis with Africa. But archaeology doesn't care about ideology. Ocean currents don't care about textbooks. Stars don't discriminate who reads them. Now here's something that rarely gets discussed in emotional terms. Exploration is not owned by any race. It's a human instinct. Curiosity, movement, risk, discovery. To assume Africa lacked that instinct until Europeans arrived is not evidence-based. It's narrative inheritance. Now imagine this differently. Imagine a West African navigator standing on a shoreline centuries before 1492, looking west, seeing the horizon, feeling curiosity. What makes us believe he wouldn't try? What makes us believe no one did? Human history is full of individuals who tested boundaries without permission from empires, and not every voyage was documented by monarchs. Some were personal, small, forgotten. Now here's where this becomes bigger than the Atlantic. This debate isn't only about Africa reaching America. It's about how we assign capability to civilizations. When we remove the colonial filter, Africa's historical record reveals complexity. Empires, universities, metallurgy, astronomy, diplomacy. Movement fits within that framework naturally. Isolation does not. So when someone reacts strongly against the possibility of ancient Black America, it often signals something deeper. It signals attachment to a version of history where Europe initiates global connection. Because if Europe didn't initiate it, if it formalized something already in motion, the mythology of exceptionalism weakens, and exceptionalism is powerful. Now here's the truth that makes people uneasy. Even if definitive proof never surfaces, even if no shipwreck is found, even if no burial site settles the debate, the possibility alone exposes bias, because the speed of dismissal often tells you more than the evidence itself. Healthy skepticism asks questions. Defensive skepticism shuts them down, and shutting down questions is rarely about facts. It's about protecting identity. Now let's bring this home. Ancient Black America before Columbus does not require conquest narratives. It does not require rewriting indigenous civilizations as African. It requires humility. It requires admitting that the pre-modern world was more interconnected than we once believed. And it requires recognizing that Africa was not a passive continent waiting for European activation. It was dynamic, complex, capable of movement, capable of risk, capable of curiosity, just like everyone else. And if even one small group crossed the Atlantic before 1492, whether by intention or accident, then the origin story shifts, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but meaningfully. Africa would no longer enter the American story only through trauma. It would enter earlier, through agency, and agency changes psychology. Now here's the final question. If tomorrow, conclusive evidence confirmed ancient Black America before Columbus, would it shock you? Or would it simply force you to confront how narrow the inherited map has been? Because the ocean never cared who crossed it first. It simply waited. And history is not finished being uncovered. The Atlantic still holds secrets. The soil still holds stories. And certainty is always temporary. So maybe the better posture isn't dismissal. Maybe it's curiosity. Because the moment we stop asking uncomfortable questions is the moment history stops growing. And history has never been small. It has only been told that way.